Welcome to The Stack, where we're having conversations with the people building the systems shaping Africa's digital future. Today, we have with us Albert, who is the director of Datawise Africa and this podcast, The African Stack. Albert, welcome to this episode. How are you feeling today?
I am good. Thank you for having me once again.
It's a pleasure to have you on your podcast.
Thank you.
So in this episode, I just want us to talk a little bit about the work that you do, the mind behind Datawise, the mind behind the African Stack, and all other work you do in AI and engineering, all that kind of stuff, and research. So I think let's start by taking a look at your background. So you have a PhD from one of Europe's supercomputing centers. Mr. PhD, Dr. sir. You're working
That's
and you're building you're building the AI infrastructure for Africa, and that's quite a bit. So what was the original pull into all of this, into this industry, this business?
It's funny when you mention the PhD stuff, because I think 99% of the time I usually don't remember I have a PhD.
Wow.
It's until someone mentions it. Then
the
it's good,
problems I want
and
to
then in my mind
have.
I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. I guess because maybe that doesn't put that doesn't represent the PhD people so well. I guess it's because PhD is one of those extremely stressful things, and when you're done with it, it's kind of like a trauma, or like, let's say, trauma coping mechanism, where you just want to forget everything that happened during that period. And and so I usually don't remember that until someone says, "Oh, Doctor something." I'm like, wait a minute. Oh yeah, actually true. Yeah, I am a doctor.
I'm here to remind
But
you.
Yeah, but anyway, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, I have a background in computer science, like you mentioned. I did my undergrad studies and my masters in Turkey, and then I moved to Spain to do my PhD. Yes, at one of the supercomputing centers here. I've been in the supercomputing world for quite some time, because after my PhD, I went to another supercomputing center and blah 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 and all that kind of thing. But my background is computer science. I love actually computer engineering, because that's the title of my degree. And in the last, I don't know how many years, I've been working a lot on computer infrastructure, data, AI, and that kind of thing. So my work kind of revolves around those three things: data, AI, and computing infrastructure. Why? Because I feel like those are the three pillars of intelligence, sort of, or of the systems that we build and the work we do at Datawise Africa. So AI being the algorithms and all that fancy stuff that you guys know about, like your ChatGPT and whatever. But behind that is the data that is required to build those AI models. And also behind that is the compute infrastructure, your GPUs, your data centers. That is, again, where all the training of those models happens and where the running of those models happen. So I intersect a lot in those three things, and we'll talk a bit more on what I do in each of them. But in a nutshell, that's hey. Background, yes, I'm from Lamu, which usually surprises a lot of people. I was born and raised in Lamu. Did my studies in Mombasa, and then funny enough, I left Kenya right after high school. So I've lived my entire adult life abroad in one country or another. I've been moving around jumping around from one country to another. I usually say that I am a professional immigrant. Jumping from one country to another. So that's my story.
I have a question. Did jumping around after high school sort of influence your decision to have a very African-based company?
Yes. I think there's this thing, there's this thing that Kenyans say, like, the most proud Kenyans are the Kenyans in the diaspora, right? Because it's like, I think it's when you're out there that you realize, we say we don't know the value of what we have until we lose it, right? So when you're in Kenya, you don't really appreciate a lot what it means to be Kenyan and to have a country and to, like, a lot of freedoms and to look like everybody else, or to have a common history, or all these shared values and that kind of thing. But when you live abroad for a long time, or especially when you're just jumping from one country to another, I usually say I stay in one country for 3 years, then I go to another country, then I go to another country, and you're constantly having to adjust to new things, constantly having to adjust to new languages. I can't tell you how many languages I've picked up in the process of jumping from one country to another.
Oh, really?
But yeah, you then realize how much you actually love your country and how much you care about the things you see there. But also, it's that sometimes it's the exposure to the different things, right? You see how different systems work and how different things happen. And you kind of wish that, you had that as well at home, right? And I guess that's why a lot of people who live in the diaspora tend to be way more patriotic or tend to say better things about Kenya than people who live in Kenya. I don't know. It's an anecdote. I don't have a lot of data to back this up.
So that's okay. So what did you see like when you were jumping around that you wanted to implement in Kenya or in Africa as a whole?
So
What was a gap?
first things
Yeah.
first. First things first was my desire to become a professor or to become an academic. This is a very funny story. When I first moved to Turkey, it was right after high school, and I joined university, and you could see how insanely passionate professors were about their work and how much they loved working with students. The balance between teaching and research and that kind of thing, like it was amazing. So by the second year of my high school, by the second year of my uni, I was so sure I wanted to be an academic. So I was so sure that this will end with a PhD, right? And that was in the second year of my, because I just looked at them and they're like, they love their life. They were living a good life. Like life on campus is amazing, right? So that was my first inspiration, right? So in fact, I usually say, and I can actually show you this letter. When I was joining grad school, and they asked us to write a motivation letter or like a statement of purpose, or I don't know what they call them nowadays. I wrote, I think it was just one paragraph, and I just said like, I want to be a professor. That's it. All I care is
Wow.
about being a professor and blah, blah, blah. I
Simple,
want to
simple
teach computer
as.
science and I want to do research in computer science. And it was one paragraph and that was it.
Wow.
Instead of writing like 2 pages of motivational letter or I don't know,
Yeah.
I was just like, I know what I want. All right,
Yeah.
you guys admit me and I will figure it out.
Wow.
And yes, I did end up
And
I
they
did end up
did.
going to grad school. Uh, they did accept me, by the way, despite my one
Wow.
paragraph statement, which sounded like, when I look back at it and when I read it now, because I've kept a copy, it seems a bit arrogant, right? But it was not coming from a point of arrogance. It was coming from a point of, I don't have so much to tell you. I just want to be a professor, That's it. Yeah. But anyway, I didn't end up, I stayed in the academic world for a long time. I did my PhD, and then I went to do my postdoc. Postdoc is that thing you do after your PhD, because apparently PhD is not enough. And then I still do teach, however, in some universities and that kind of thing. And I still care deeply about, academic research and teaching. But over the way, one of the things I realized was also we needed to do research that is outside the university, right? That is outside, big tech and that kind of thing. And that's why Datawise Africa came into existence, right? To bridge this gap and to do like a different level of research, which is what we call like applied research, research that has direct impact to the society, research that builds products, builds tools that the society can directly use, and that kind of thing. So yes, I'm still in both worlds. I still love academia, but I'm still very keen on doing like research that has direct impact in the community.
Mhm. What kind of impact are you looking to make? Like, is it just technological impact, or do you want your research, like, what specifically do you want your research to do or to work towards?
That's a very interesting question. Honestly, it's not just about the technology, right? Building the technology is one thing, but I always believe you cannot build the technology outside the humans. So a lot of the research I do and the research I love working on, and even my academic work, has a lot to do with building human capacity, right? Like, if you notice at Datawise, we always start with people who are interns, and then they come in and they develop their skill sets and that kind of thing. But and when I'm teaching or like supervising master students or even PhD students, that's what I'm thinking about. It's not just research. It's, as we build the research, can we also build the human capacity to in parallel with this? So that's the kind of impact I'm talking about. If you're going to build large language models for Kiswahili, can we also build the people who can train these large language models? And this has been my biggest advocacy work, is around when we build compute infrastructure for Africa, the GPUs, let's not just build the GPUs, let's also build the people who can operate and run these GPUs, the people who can maintain this GPU, the people who can, operate supercomputers and that kind of thing. So it's a double world for me. The human is equally as important as the technology, the skill sets that we build and that kind of thing. So I'm very keen on developing the human capacity and also the technology. And that's largely also because of my background, right? As I was going through my studies in undergrad and grad school, I had a lot of professors who were like really keen on that, really keen on shaping me as a human being, right? Not just shaping me as a very good computer engineer, right? It's kind of like a double thing. And I go back, or I went back with a lot of those skills and a lot of that desire to kind of like emulate that, right? So that's why the work we do has a lot of impact, not just the technology. I'm keen on building amazing technology, but I'm also keen on building the people who will run that amazing technology.
Mm. Is that
Yeah.
something that you've seen like in the countries that you've been to that you've decided to implement here, or is that just from your head? That's just wisdom from your head.
I think it's both. It's both. Like like I mentioned, working with all these other people out there, and also like living in these countries and seeing the skill sets and the technical capacity. And so it's like I said, it's not just having like fancy systems and there are not people who can operate them, or you have to import everyone who can operate them. It's a balance of both. But for me, it's also like it's kind of like a visionary thing. I like to look ahead in the future. I think the continent, and by the continent I mean Africa, we're heading to the point where we will be the epicenter of the world, right? And you cannot be an epicenter of the world if you don't have both, right? Highly skilled human capital, and also like the technical and technological advancements and that kind of thing. So it's looking ahead and thinking, what are we going to need as a continent 10, 15, 50 years from now, right? It's those two things, and we have to figure out a way to kind of balance. And to be honest, I'm not thinking that I'm the one doing this, right? There's a lot of people who are involved in this kind of work. Our universities are doing a great job. And they're adopting pretty fast into like building the necessary capital required to do some of this work, but also the people who understand our societies. The other thing is also looking at what happens when we build technology outside the people, right? When we just import technology. It's a very dangerous thing to do that, right? Imagine building language systems without involving the people in that community. You miss a lot, right? You miss the nuances of that community, the behavior and that kind of thing. So especially with a technology like AI, it's extremely important that we involve the people that is going to serve in building that technology. Otherwise, you're going to end up with, I don't know, you've seen these stupid cases of like, I don't know, there is what is it called? Like a sensor for washing hands, but it doesn't
Yeah.
detect black hands. And that tells you,
Oh.
like, stupidly enough, that was built by someone who had not thought about, like, black people exist. And maybe
Mm.
the adjustments of this, it's a very stupid example, okay? The adjustments of this kind of system should factor that in. So imagine that's a very low level, right? But imagine now you have to build a medical system without factoring in that community, right? Without factoring in the anatomy of different people and that kind of thing. That becomes a very dangerous thing. That's why I'm keen on not just the technology, but also we have to be involved in building the technology.
You actually
Yeah.
said something really wise that I think we say in our terms, we say don't just give them the fish, teach them how to fish.
Yeah. Teach them how to fish as well. Yeah.
If you were to compare the two worlds, the Western world versus what we have in Africa, in terms of the research and infrastructure and in the technological world, how big would you say that gap is between the two worlds? And how is it closing, or are we very far from the other side?
So I'll speak on my field, that is AI. I think that gap used to be big, but right now it's closing so fast. And the reason it's closing is because of a lot of people who have put in a lot of effort to close that gap, right? We have amazing researchers and amazing professors, in the continent who are really closing in that gap. And I'm going to give you examples. Like when I started in AI work, I started like going really deep into AI around 2017-ish, 2018-ish. There was very little data that we could use for our applications, right? Let's look at languages. There was very little data that you could use for building a language model, or back then they were not really called large language models. They were just like we were using something called LSTMs and all these kind of things. Um, But then, so most of the African languages, actually all the African languages, were classified as low resource languages, right? Today, we have so many, not so many, but we have quite a number of languages that we cannot consider them as low resource languages, right? Enormous work has gone into that gap, closing that gap. And this is because, we went back to being who we are truly as African, right? The community approach. So there were so many communities that were formed around closing this gap, like Deep Learning Indaba is one of those communities that I'm quite involved in. Masakane is one of those communities. There were so many of these communities that were involved in closing in this gap. And now today, we can't really say Kiswahili is a low resource language. No, a lot of work has been done to close that gap. There's a lot of work that is being done to close gaps in, let's say, Kikuyu, Luo. There's a professor in Maseno University. Her name is Dr. Lillian. She's doing amazing work in terms of closing these gaps in language and data. So we were so much behind, but in true African fashion, it's amazing how much that gap has closed in just less than 10 years. So today, we stand at a point where we have a really significant number of African PhDs, especially in AI. We have really good research labs in the continent. One of them is in South Africa, being led by Professor Kosi, and others scattered all over the country, or the continent, right? So that gap has significantly closed. Well, are we still behind? Yes, on some things. And this is the things that we're behind. For example, we are still very behind on compute, right? We don't have enough supercomputers in Africa. I think the last time I checked, there were just 2 supercomputers in Africa. But that gap is also being closed. There's a lot of efforts to close that gap. And I'm also very involved in that effort. But also, right now, we have more investors who are interested in bringing GPUs to the continent. A company like Cassava just announced that they're bringing thousands of GPUs to the continent. So the simple answer is we are closing that gap, and I'm super happy to see the efforts, but there's still a lot of work to be done. We still are not producing enough PhDs for what is required to pull off these efforts. We're not putting enough money into R&D for what's required to close this effort. And also, to be honest with you, there's not enough investment in terms of technology that goes into the continent. And that we will always see that as a result in the gaps that are being created. But I just want to appreciate that, yes, it's incredible how much work was done in just 10 years. Yeah.
Mhm. So you say there's not enough investment coming in. I hear that a lot of investment is going into things like fintech. Is that accurate, or like is there somewhere else that the investments should be going
No, to be
to
honest,
help the
it's not like,
cause?
even in fintech, people think there's a lot of investment going into in fintech. But if you compare to the rest of the world, it's just a drop in the ocean, right? It's not really that much that it should be. Like companies in the US or some companies in Europe are raising like $1 billion just like that, right? We are barely able to raise 500,000, right? I think the largest exit was InstaDeep sometime like 2-3 years ago. I think at 500,000,000. You see, so that's a gap. In as much as yes, people think fintech, and I do agree. Yes, people in fintech are able to raise significant amount of money, uh, and but AI startups are also raising a lot of money, and not, but it's still a drop compared to what's happening in the rest of the world. Why? And this is important. Like research money, and I'm just speaking more on research here than just like general investment. Research money comes from so many sides, right? But a big chunk of that also comes from government, right? Government research. How much of our budget are we dedicating to R&D? If we're still dedicating less than 1% of our budget to R&D, it's really a drop of the ocean compared to other countries that had dedicating 5% of their budget to R&D and that kind of thing. So what does that mean? If there is a bigger pool of money for R&D, we're able to fund the research labs in the universities better. We're able to put money into things like buying compute and figuring out like how we can have a national infrastructure for compute, um, and that kind of thing. But as it stands, despite the efforts, it's still very little that is coming in terms of investments on R&D or investments on developing technology. But I understand also, if you are a government policymaker, between creating a maternity hospital in Lambu
Yeah.
and making sure Albert has 10 GPUs to work with, even me, I would go
Yeah.
for the maternity hospital, right? So our
Yeah.
priorities are different, maybe at this time, but I do feel like there is still an opportunity to not completely neglect what's happening in the research world. Why? Because also with the research world, we're able to solve a lot of these other problems that the society is experiencing, right? Closing, healthcare gaps. Um, solve some of our food and agriculture problems and that kind of thing. So it's you can't neglect one and give the other. But I also see the challenge in balancing our priorities.
Yeah, because I was actually gonna say, or like ask rather, can't you use the research to build the correct hospitals or to use the data to, do the right things that needs to be done? So I feel like they
Yeah,
go hand in hand.
they go hand in hand. Yes,
Obviously one would be more expensive than the other, but yeah, they do go hand in hand.
exactly.
But I want
They
you
go
to tell
hand in
us a
hand.
bit
Yes.
more about the deep learning Indaba that you're working on.
So, Deep Learning Indaba is an organization that is promoting. It actually says the mission is strengthening AI in Africa. I attended the first Deep Learning Indaba event when I was in my first year of PhD, I think 2018, in South Africa, and it was a really good community. And so, what Deep Learning Indaba does, it brings in all the machine learning enthusiasts from the different parts of the country, the continent. We actually have a representation of about 45 countries from Africa out of the 54 or 55 total. So that's a significant number. And it's here that we do a lot of. So deep learning never has grown into so many um, things in parallel. So we have things like workshops of different communities. We have communities themselves. Like I mentioned, something like Masakane was a community that grew out of deep learning in Daba. We have, technical panels. We have tutorials, and also it targets like people who are early in their career or people who are trying to just get into machine learning, but also people who are um, um, well established in the AI world. So it's a deep learning in Daba where we'll have big names in the AI world interacting with undergraduate students from the continent and that kind of thing. This year it's going to Nigeria, and I happen to be one of the general chairs for the deep learning in Daba. Very very big honor. And we're focusing a lot on sovereign intelligence, and you can see from my talk that I'm very keen on sovereign intelligence.
Yeah.
It's and basically sovereign intelligence is the ability of countries to build and operate their own systems, not in isolation, in collaboration, but that ability to build, maintain, operate their own systems. And so we ask ourselves what's then required to build sovereign intelligence, right? It's these things that I talked about earlier. Data, compute, the talent, and all those kind of things, and the investments and all that. So yeah, it's happening in Nigeria on the first week of August. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you for that promotion. I think a lot of us will be looking
I, I
forward to that.
I think I promoted it a bit too much, but yeah.
No, no, we're happy to hear it. We're happy to hear it, please.
Yeah,
But like, tell
yeah.
me more about this sovereign intelligence. How realistic is it for us to build sovereign like AI in Africa, infrastructure wise, capital, anything?
To be honest, very realistic, and we're already making big strides on this. Why? Because sovereign intelligence is okay. So let's look at where the world is going. Right, AI is in our day-to-day lives. It's integrated. It's everything. Well, not everything, but it's a core part of our day-to-day life. Right. There's not a day goes that I don't use ChatGPT. Right. There's not a day go by that I don't use some Gemini to help me type an email or that kind of thing. Um, so that's one. Number two, there's a lot of economy around AI, right? There's a lot of money revolving around AI. Now imagine if you isolate an entire country, or you have a country not taking part in this economy. You know, uh, it's a big loss. Number one. Number two, it's you become reliant on someone else. And I think if there's anything the world has learned in the last few years, especially with everything going on, in global politics, is how important it is to be self-reliant at times, right? Um, and not just self-reliant for the sake of self-reliant. It's self-reliant for a lot of things. Like, can you make your own drugs? Can you train your own doctors? Can you run your own systems and that kind of thing? If you're super dependent on other countries, or if you're super dependent on someone else, and one day, and this, as we have seen, happens a lot. One day, someone pulls that plug, you're completely in the dark, right? And that kind of thing. So the way I think about it is, we need to think about sovereign intelligence the same way we think about um, telecommunications or things like national grid systems, right? So in Kenya, we have Safaricom or Airtel, and they operate within the boundaries of our country, right? If you go to Uganda, yes, you can still have Safaricom with roaming, with some agreements and that kind of thing. But as a country, we do have our own telecommunication infrastructure. So if one day Uganda decided to shut down their telephone network, Kenya would still be okay, right? We can still make calls, we can still do other things, right? The same way with Tanzania, we have our own internet and that kind of thing. So number one, yes, there is integration, and that's why I said earlier that sovereign intelligence doesn't mean isolation. There is integration, but there is a level of control to that particular region or to that particular country, and that's the same way we think about intelligence, because it's such an essential technology to not have a certain level of control. Now, when I talk about a certain level of control, I don't mean just um, you know pushing the buttons. Control means also being able to build it, right? Being able to operate it. And so for me, that's what I see with sovereign intelligence. It's Kenya saying that we have an AI system that runs our police department or that is used by our police department and that belongs to Kenya. So if United States decided to shut down something, we would still be able to make police reports and that kind of thing, right? And this needs to be thought of not just like AI only, but just software in general, right? We would still be able to operate it. The same way we have our national grid. Yes, sometimes we buy electricity from Ethiopia, but even if Ethiopia was to shut down their supply to us, we wouldn't completely duck. We can still generate some power for ourselves. That's the same way I think about this when it comes to sovereign intelligence.
And is this hand in hand with what you said a few months ago? You posted on LinkedIn about AI being like a supply chain. I don't know if you remember that post, but you talked
So
about how
yes,
like
yes.
yeah. So can you tell us a bit more about that if it's connected?
That was, yes. No, my thinking around that was slightly different, and that's now on the economic side of things. What I say is the amount of money required to build some of this crazy, advanced technology is so much for one particular country to pull off, right? And we have seen that in so many other aspects, right? For example, even let's take a look at Airbus. Airbus is a European company that builds airplane and everything, but there is not a single European country that can pull this off and say we're going to build Airbus by ourselves. You're going to be the second largest manufacturer of planes in the world, and blah, blah. No, it needs a collective effort. So a bunch of countries decided to come together and say this is such a big technological thing that we need efforts together and we should pull off. And so they did that, and they managed to have the Airbus and that kind of thing. Now, I my anecdote for that was when it comes to technology, especially like the super complex models and large models and that kind of thing, we have to somehow be involved in this to get a chunk of that cake. Why? Because today there are hundreds and maybe thousands and thousands of Kenyans that use ChatGPT, right, as a tool. But the thing is, ChatGPT is an American company. We pay all that $20 monthly subscription to the American company, but there is very little of that $20 chunk that we get as a country, right? So my idea was we need to think of this as a supply chain thing. If ChatGPT, if we pay $20 to OpenAI, can Kenya get $1 of that? Because there's so many other countries that are actually involved in building this ChatGPT that they get a chunk of that $1, right? The compute infrastructure is probably somewhere in another country. The scientists who built this are probably somewhere in another country. The data was collected in another country, and blah blah blah. Now, that's not to say that Kenya is not getting a chunk of this. We are actually getting a chunk of this, but probably not in the best way possible, right? Kenya has several data annotation companies. Some of the models were fine tuned after. I mean, the data annotation work. Some of it happened in Kenya, and that's part of being a supply chain. But being part of the supply chain, right? But what I'm saying is, and there was a lot of controversy, rightfully so, around the data annotators and that. But what I'm saying is, we also need to have a bigger chunk of that, right? Can we also, I don't know, can some of the scientists be based in Kenya? Can some of the scientists be Kenyans? Can some of that building the model work be in Kenya? Can some of those data centers be in Kenya? And not just Kenya. Basically, what I'm saying is the AI, the super high tech AI is such a complex thing, and there's so many partners in it. And instead of thinking about how Kenya is going to build their own chat GPT, step one is probably saying, can we get $1 out of the $20 from ChatGPT? That was my thinking around this, because it's the same thing that happens in planes, right? And the example I gave was like an Airbus A320, right? When it rolls out of that manufacturing plant in Toulouse or whatever, there's so many countries that have been involved in that. There's so many countries that get a chunk of that, right? And that's extremely important. So in the complicated world of supply chains for AI, how can we be part of that economy? That was my
Hmm.
argument.
So you're asking the question, do you have an answer to that question? Like how can we actually be involved? Is it that we're giving data or like what kind of involvement is it?
Not yet. I don't have an answer to that, but I'm working on
Okay.
that. Hopefully, I will have an answer. But I also don't want us to be just like the mining. Like Africa has been exploited for way too long, right? When it came to
Yeah.
like other things, we were just being mined, and now we have a lot of data. Let's face it, we have a lot of data. We are the last frontier even in data. So it shouldn't be just like Africa's only part in this supply chain is providing data and getting very little value, right? So no, there has to be a better way to do this.
And do you think Africa
Yeah.
would be at risk of becoming like just a data supplier for global AI systems? Or is that not really a risk for us?
I think we run that risk if we're not very careful. But the good thing is there are smart people in some governments that have seen ahead, and there are so many now laws that are coming up around data protection, protecting, thinking of data as a proper resource, just the way we think of gold as a resource, and building laws to protect that, to govern that, and that kind of thing. And also, that's one of the work we've been doing at Datawise, right? Data Lab is this platform that we built. That is essentially built around that, saying that data from Kenya should stay in Kenya. If you want to use data from Kenya, come to Kenya, operate it from Kenya, build your systems here, and that kind of thing. And data movement from Kenya to say Rwanda should be governed by very strict laws. We need the same way. I cannot just mine some gold in Kakamega and take it to Rwanda for refinement without going through a lot of rules, right? We need to think the same way when it comes to data. What we need to protect it and honestly, we don't just need to protect it as a resource. We need to protect it as a national heritage. The way we look at our national parks, the way we look at our minerals, the way we look at what lies in the ground, that's what we define as national heritage, right? That's the same way we need to be thinking about data is our national heritage and therefore protected as such. And that comes back to the point of sovereign AI, right? Can we build our own systems around how we can govern that data, how we can operate that data? That is not to say there is not going to be exchange. No, there should be exchange. The world needs to be interoperable at some point because we can never be 100% reliant. But that interoperability should not be exploitation. That's the part I'm against. Yeah.
Okay, that's a very good point. It should not be exploitation. Yeah,
Yes.
thank you
Yes.
for that. Because we should give, but we should also be able to get back. I think, yeah, it should be a fair
Exactly.
exchange. I want
Exactly.
to ask you, where do you think AI genuinely, when I say genuinely, I mean that heavily, genuinely creates value in our systems and in our economy, if at all it does at this point in time?
Very good question. I think AI does have a lot of value. Um, and I say that also genuinely. It's sometimes hard to see where this value is because when you talk about AI, what a lot of people see is ChatGPT. And these are the things that we are, tagging someone on Facebook and that kind of thing. But there's a lot of value beyond those tools. And I can give you a ton of examples. We actually just concluded our research with our data insights team, with Winnie and the others, that was really looking into these cases. There are many places where AI creates genuine value. And not to say that ChatGPT is not value. It is value, right? Some people, like, even me, I need it, right? I can see how valuable it has become in my day-to-day work. But beyond that, it's let's take a look at Kenya or Africa specifically, right? So number one is healthcare. AI is helping significantly bridge the gap in healthcare. Why? And there are multiple ways this is happening. On the very, very super high level, it's drug discovery. We're able to discover new drugs much, much faster and create new drugs much, much faster, right? So that's number one. It's processes that would take 10 years can now be done in 2 years, right? That's number one. There are companies called biotech companies that are doing amazing job in terms of drug discovery. But still, drug discovery for my mom or for my neighbor might still be very, very far away, right? Because that's something we cannot understand or something. But now going back to much more to what we would see in our daily life is kind of like how we are embedding AI into diagnostic tools, right? When you want to diagnose something like cancer or some other disease, like let's not even go to cancer, let's go to like things like malaria or tuberculosis or these kind of things. Traditionally, you would have, not traditionally, even today, you still require like a significantly well trained person to look into those images, to look into those lab results, and to do that kind of diagnostics. In Kenya, I can tell you for sure, we don't have that many of those experts that we're talking about. So a hospital in a rural place might not necessarily have that. But imagine if we embedded some AI model in that diagnostic tool, and a lab technician with a diploma can be able to perform, can be able to understand or diagnose something that would have ordinarily required a specialist with, I don't know, 11 years of medical training to diagnose that. We're helping bridge that gap, right? We're catching these things earlier, right? That we would help. Because a lot of diseases in Kenya go undetected for way too long. And by the time it gets to a specialist, it's too late, right? So that's number one. We're helping really bridge that gap from just diagnostics tool. And there are so many of these companies that have been doing a lot of work around this. There are technologies that have been developed that you can diagnose malaria with just your phone, or you can diagnose some more hidden diseases, especially the infectious ones, with just like a camera and that kind of thing. The same thing with like chest X-rays, diagnosing things like pneumonia or other things that can be manifested by chest X-rays that would ordinarily require a highly trained person. Not to say we don't need doctors in the loop, but if it helps us bridge that gap in the sense that early detection, right, and then a doctor can actually look at the case, right? So it cannot. When AI says this person most likely has this disease, we don't take that word as the true word of God. No, that still needs to go to a medical doctor, right, for verification and that kind of thing. But it helps us identify so many of these cases that a doctor would ordinarily not have been able to. Why? Because first of all, we have an acute shortage of especially specialist medical professionals in the country, right? And in so many parts of Kenya is slightly better if you compare to other parts of the world. Um, so that's kind of like, I would say I'm seeing a lot of value there for sure. Agriculture, right? We we didn't we have tools now that can help us tell us, this particular crop or this particular plantation is suffering from this disease, and this is the kind of pesticide you should buy and use it for this particular thing. So small scale farmers are also being helped here. The other part, which is big, is information, right? We're able to digest, compose this information, and feed it to the farmers very, very fast. The other part that a lot of people would ordinarily not think about is things like weather prediction. So we have very major gaps in weather prediction in the continent. We don't have enough weather stations. We don't have enough professionals for that kind of thing and whatnot. With AI, we're able to do localized weather prediction and say precisely which regions, how much rain, and that kind of thing. And that's very important information to just policymakers, farmers, everyone. So there's a lot of value. But for us to see this value, and again, I go back to my point of sovereign intelligence, we must, first of all, identify what are our problems that we want to solve with AI. We cannot just dismiss and say, ChatGPT is useless. Yeah, it might not be useless. It might be useless for my mom, right? Because she probably doesn't need ChatGPT. But there are other important, you cannot dismiss the entire technology based on that. There are other important problems for my mom and for the people in my community that could be solved with AI, right? So that's how I think about it, right? There's a lot of value, but for us to really see that value, we must be the ones involved in building that technology because we know our problems better than anyone else. There's a reason why we have M-Pesa and Spain doesn't have M-Pesa because we know our problems better than anyone else. So we
Yeah.
must be able to solve those very particular problems that concern us with this technology rather than just importing it and then waiting for some magic to happen.
You've actually said a lot of important points, especially I think you've really opened up let me speak for myself, my mind to AI because I'm also one of those people who is like, oh, ChatGPT, Claude AI. But like in terms of weather, agriculture, infrastructure, like there's so much that we're using AI for that we don't even realize on a day-to-day basis. So thank you really for bringing that out. And I think there's so much that we can add to this conversation, but I just want us to close and I don't want to ignore the fact that you are the director and allow me to say founder of the African Stack podcast. Albert, what was your vision for the African Stack? Why did you want this podcast to exist?
I started earlier by saying that if you look at the last 10 years, there is so much that has happened in our continent in terms of closing some of these technology gaps. If you look at the progress we've made in AI alone within the continent, if you look at the progress we've made in terms of improving the coverage of our languages for AI, it's so much. And that's just one aspect of the whole AI world, right? There's so much more that's happening. There's so many more PhDs that we have trained. There's so many master students that we've trained. There's so many people who have gotten, high-paying, distant jobs out of technology and that kind of thing. And more often than not, we don't hear these stories. We don't know what's going on around this world. Nobody knows the efforts being, well, this now people, at least people within the AI world know, right? But a lot of people don't know the efforts that goes on behind some of our AI labs in Africa, like some of our, they don't know the work that some of our professors do to bridge the gap or to build the models that are relevant for our language, or even the issue that I talked about, like diagnosing diseases in our plants or building X-ray systems that can help doctors in super remote places to diagnose diseases. So there's that information gap, and that's why when you look at AI, when you look at this technology, for a lot of people, it's just like it's ChatGPT. But there's so much more that goes on to building this. So the African stack was around this idea of, can we have candid conversations with people who build these technologies, with people who are like in the trenches, looking for data, building models with extremely limited resources, and training PhD students with, again, extremely limited resources. Can we have this conversation with these people so that we can be aware that this actually works, that is going on, that there's so much more than we see that is going on. That was the idea behind the African Stack. It's to have conversations with builders, professors, researchers, scientists, students, people building the African Stack. And to explain what a stack is in software, we usually say, like, if you build a website, the stack is Node.js and I don't know, Python, blah blah. It's the kind of like the tools that build. It's kind of like the layered tools that build a particular system. So for me and for the African stack, it's asking ourselves, what is the African stack in terms of technology, right? In terms of AI, the African stack is about the data, it's about the compute, it's about the people, it's about the ecosystems that we're building and the communities that we're building. And this is what the African Stack podcast is all about: talking to those people who build and help contribute to building the African stack, and learning about what's happening in the trenches, what's happening in the real world, how are they doing, and appreciating the work they're doing. Because let's be honest, it's a lot of work they're doing, and they're doing incredibly amazing work. Sometimes I read some scientific papers from some of the PhD students or the master students, especially, for example, at Deep Learning Indaba, and I'm like, damn, this is so good.
Yeah.
So that is the African stack.
Actually, in our episode with Winnie, which our audience will listen to if you haven't listened to it already, she was talking about the kind of work that she's doing, and I was like, "Whoa, it's actually a lot." Like, and I've never heard, if because I'm not in the tech world as such, but you don't really hear these things just in the general, conversations that we're having about the continent and about the data and the AI and the work that we need to do to be able to get further on in technology and all that kind of stuff. So, Albert, this was a great initiative. Thank you very much. And we will close the episode there. So, thank you so much, Albert, for joining us
Thank you for
today.
having me.
It was a lovely, lovely session. And I hope there's obviously so much more to be said. So, I hope we can do this again sometime, maybe.
I hope we can do this again.
Great. So for now, to our audience, you've been listening to The African Stack, a podcast powered by Datawise Africa. Thank you for tuning in and see you in the next episode.